We are so thankful today to welcome Dr. Jameson Hardy to the podcast. How you doing, Doc?
Doing great, man. Doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Good to have you. I'm glad to talk to you about your new book. It's impressive. So we'll dive in with some questions and see where the Lord leads us in this whole discussion.
Alrighty.
So give me the best piece of advice you've ever received.
That's a great question. I think we don't focus on this enough because as I thought about some of this, I really thought back to advice that I've been given. And I would highlight two specific pieces, one that I was spoken about or told to, and the other one that I wasn't told about, I just witnessed. And that is the first piece of advice that I was given by my pastor was, don't ask your people in the church to do anything you are not willing to do yourself. Any effective leader in general, but any effective pastoral leader will not ask the people of God he serves to do anything that he himself is not willing to do. And so that would be the greatest piece of advice I've been given, verbally from one pastor to at that time, a layperson my pastor gave me. The second piece of advice has to do with that, and that is watching my own father simply go about the work of being a participant in church. And we used to live across the street, and one of the jobs he did was to go over and check the church doors at night to make sure they were all locked. And I used to go with him when I was a little boy. Now, you and I are not little, but I was little at once. And I remember going through the church sanctuary, and it was dark, and my dad never turned any lights on because he had the place memorized. And I remember walking through the sanctuary and afraid that Jesus was going to speak to me from the crucifix on the altar. And my father just very joyfully checked all the doors, walked through the church. And I just remember watching my dad be a churchman and never lectured me, never talked to me. So in my life, I think those two pieces of advice, one given verbally and then one just lived, would have to be the top two kind of pieces of advice that I've had in my life.
Well, I love that. Sometimes the best advice is what you said, the ones we witness, not the ones we always hear, because that sticks with us a lot longer.
That's right.
I love to ask my guests this question because we don't always stop and think about people who've been important to us, but I want to always give my guests a chance to kind of give a shout out to those people who've inspired them, maybe served as mentors to them. So you think back on your life, who are some people that you just have had a powerful impact on your life and your formation?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question because I think there are a lot actually in my life, and I'm going to start right at home with my great grandmother, Martha Cloa, who, when I was confirmed, my pastor and her in German, mind you, at my confirmation service, my pastor was talking to her in German, and they at that time, 1984. Calculated that great-grandma Cloa was responsible for 144 LCMS Lutherans, direct descendants in the family. To this day, I was the first pastor in that lineage, and we have many more now. But it starts with great-grandma, goes to my grandmother, goes to my father. But then outside the family, I would have to say none other than my own parish pastor, the sainted Ralph Fisher, who told me when I was a third grader that I was going to be a pastor. And I said, I'm going to play for the Detroit Lions. And thank God that didn't happen. Although this year they're showing signs of life. So maybe I'll regret it this year. But, and then I would move on throughout my life to other influential people. And that would be my wrestling coach in high school, Mr. Dennis Twomey, who I've had the pleasure of, this sounds kind of weird, but I've had the pleasure of burying. I officiated at his funeral, which was an honor for me. His son, Tom Twomey, who was my physical wrestling coach, who took me from a boy to a man, several professors at college and at seminary, and then in my professional pastoral life, Mr. Keith Ferndag, who just finished 13 years on Synod's board of directors, who is the CEO of Concordia Lutheran Ministries in Pennsylvania. This man has been absolutely influential, is the reason that I went on to get a master's in public administration, leadership, and finance, and a doctorate in the same, because I couldn't keep up with him. I mean, the guy is just brilliant, and I found myself falling in love with the biblical side of leadership, partly because of just his example and friendship. And so, I've been blessed with having a lot of influential people kind of touch my life and bring me along to where I'm at. And in the book, I write a number of acknowledgments In college, I would say to you, the chief was Dr. Jim Jurgensen, my advisor and mentor at the time, and had really had the greatest impact on me really in my second half of my life, because he said to me one thing. He said, are you going to live by difficulties, or are you going to live with difficulties? Meaning, are you going to let the negative things in your life dictate, or are you going to deal with those negative things in life and move forward? And it's really been impactful as a pastor, because as you well know, being in this business, there's a lot of great days, but there's also a lot of tough days. And are you going to live by those tough days or with those tough days? So that's what I would say along my journey.
Those people, all those people in our lives, we get a chance to kind of think back to the different impacts they've had and the different times that God put them in our lives, and the lasting impact is always kind of meaningful.
That's right. That's right.
So tell us about your journey. Everybody has that moment in life, that journey that gets us to where we are in ministry. What led you into the pastoral office?
Yeah, as I said, my pastor told me from a young age on that I was going to be a pastor, and I never really believed him. I never really accepted it. I went on to play football and wrestle in Concordia, Wisconsin, and got a teacher education degree, and still up until my junior year was just going to be a teacher. My brother Tim just finished 13 years on CTCR, and he's the vice principal at Lutheran High North, football coach, basketball coach. Kind of, I saw myself in the same vein, serving the church, but teaching, a religion or history, which is what my undergrad was. And then one year, my third year actually, it's at college, I was on the youth ministry team. And this group of 12 college kids that went over to churches and did lock-ins and, the 9 yards, they did activities, Bible studies, stuff. And I realized one night that this was not what God wanted me to do. I don't like staying up all night. I became the designated driver for the youth ministry team because I got that 2 hours of sleep. They let me go take a nap. And I remember distinctively, Keith, going back from one trip from northern Wisconsin back to Mequon. And I just remember saying to myself, this is not what God wants me to do. I'm not, I love dealing with the high school kids. That's not the issue. This whole kind of focused area of lock-ins and youth ministry, it just wasn't for me. And I remember saying to myself, what can God do with my gifts? And that is to say, the gifts that he gave me. And one of those gifts that he gave me, and I know you share this gift, is the ability to profess my faith, speak about the word of God, and to love the neighbor as itself. And those things combined, I looked in the mirror and I said, Lord, this is not what I thought, but I can obviously see this is what you think. And that is, where can I use the gift that you give me, which is my mouth? And he said, it's the church. So, I never declared pre-seminary. I stayed in the track of teacher education. I got my classwork done. I finished as a teacher education student. But then in my senior year, I declared for the seminary. And I went to the presentation for both Fort Wayne and St. Louis and realized that Roosevelt Gray and St. Williams recruited me to Fort Wayne. And that's where I ended up. I had no intention of going there. There was no theological reason. There was no liturgical reason. I just had great recruiters, St. and Roosevelt, and I ended up at Fort Wayne. And I think it was God's hand. And I'm thrilled that the Lord opened my heart and my mind to do that. But my road was to be a high school football and wrestling coach and to teach religion and history. But God found a way to put me in the church as a parish pastor.
That's so cool. They led me to Fort Wayne too. I met my wife there, then I transferred to St. Louis. So, I guess.
Oh, really? I didn't know you started at Fort Wayne. Yeah. What year did you start? What year was that?
1988.
So you're 4 years ahead of me. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Roosevelt. Look, I tell you, I owe a lot to Roosevelt and St. because they helped shepherd me through the process. And I saw St. at the convention this year, and he reminded me of it. He reminded, because he had a huge influence. But our brother St. Then he followed it up with asking me to support the caucus, and so
that's right. Yeah, you tried to wrestle my arm on that one too. So
there you go.
So let's talk about your book on leadership. I know, as one who studies and loves leadership, that there are a ton of books out there on leadership. What makes your book different from all those others?
Well, my personal opinion on this is very clear. I studied, my doctorate is in leadership, and so I read a ton of books in different denominations. Let me just say, the Reformed Church have us completely outnumbered when it comes to leadership books. Almost all the good leadership books are in the Reformed Church. It's just the way it is. The seminary president out in California, Jeff Iorg, is by far, in my opinion, one of the best leadership writing clergymen in the Protestant denominations. But what makes my book stand out, I think, is the premise of my book. I start out and I carry throughout the entire book a simple phraseology that pastoral leadership is pastoral care. And I think when you read the entirety of my book, what you'll get is that everything with pastoral leadership starts with the office of the ministry in preaching, administration of the sacraments. I think that's not an anomaly, meaning that's not a foreign concept, but what you'll see in my book is that everything is generated from that principle. I don't stop there, however. I think a lot of guys want to talk about leadership, want to stop there. They want to say that the highest form of pastoral leadership is preaching and teaching and visitation, and I think that is the ultimate expression of pastoral leadership. But what I disagree with is the idea that pastoral leadership stops there. In fact, I think in terms of the exposure a pastor has to a layperson's life, that is an hour to 2 hours in a 7-day period, which is the height of responsibility and connectivity. But I look at the rest of the week in my book as well. So I maintain in every chapter the premise that pastoral leadership is pastoral care. But I look at a very numbered nuance of ideas and also concepts of leadership, kind of like I started off with when it comes to the greatest piece of advice, that a lot of pastors miss the boat. They want their people to do things they're not willing to do, such as personal devotion, such as devout prayer life, such as loving and serving the neighbor. These are things that you can teach your people by doing and not necessarily by lecturing or by verbally speaking it. So I spent a lot of time in my book on those things that support the premise that pastoral leadership is pastoral care.
Love it. So the name of your book, title of your book is Pastoral Leadership, Shepherding and Caring for God's People. And you start out talking about biblical examples of leadership. I'm curious, as you put those together, which biblical style do you think you kind of model your leadership after?
Yeah, this is unique too, I think, when you ask about the book itself. That first chapter is more so designed to talk about the biblical characters of leadership and their failures in leadership. What I mean by that is the burden that they carried. I mean, you look at Adam. Adam was afraid to be the leader, right? When you look at Moses was kind of making excuses for everything. You know, I can't speak. Well, God says, I'll give you Aaron. You know, David, the great David, when the prophet Nathan came to him and told him the story about the rich man stealing the poor man's sheep or goat, David said that man should be, punished or killed. And Nathan said, you are that man. So for me, the first chapter really has a lot to do with talking about areas where I've been a failure at, and I needed to have support. But when it comes to the characters in the Bible, in that first chapter, I would probably have to put myself more closely with Moses. And I think the reason why I would choose Moses in that first chapter is because Moses was not a wallflower, let's say. Moses grew up in the court of Pharaoh. He was used to being the center of attention. He was used to being loved and respected and feared, I guess, in some cases. And he was used to being out front. When he left Egypt and fled because he killed an Egyptian, he kind of went into seclusion. None of that stuff he had previously was taken away from him. And I think we don't do a good enough job in our teaching of Moses to articulate, yeah, he told God, I don't want to do this, I'm just a shepherd and I can't speak. But none of the gifts God gave him while he was the son of Pharaoh were taken from Moses. And yet God had high and great expectations for Moses, despite Moses' thoughts of himself. And so that's why I resonate with Moses. because I know God has placed great responsibility on me in many ways as a parish pastor, as a district president, as a father, as a brother, as a husband. And so, I always look at myself and think there's always more that God is asking me to do with the gifts he's giving me. And I think when you look at the entirety of the Moses story, you see all this kind of up and downs with Moses. And it culminates there with the Ten Commandments. And it culminates with Moses basically saying to God's people, here's the line and we don't cross it. And then Moses himself crossed it. And God said, you're not going to the promised land because of this. So the greatest of God's servants can also be the greatest sinners amongst us. And it's up to God to choose how and where and when he uses those. So I would attach myself in that whole first chapter to Moses, probably the most.
Something you said about those leaders, I think I want to kind of drill down on a little bit more. I wonder if some of the reasons people are afraid to be a leader in the church is because of that word failure. It's easier if we don't take a leadership role. We can't fail that way, right? In some people's minds. So if I'm not actually leading, then if it doesn't work out, you can't blame me for it.
Correct. That's right. Yeah, I'll tell you, I'm doing a 10-part series for KFUO on my book on leadership. And this question came up on failure and fear. And I'll tell you this right now, in my opinion, the greatest leaders are those who can accept that they will fail and not stop. That sounds kind of counterintuitive, because a great leader, how are they going to accept that they're going to fail? It's just statistical odds are not in our favor, that at some point you and I are going to make massive mistakes or sinful situations that are going to cause us to be unworthy. And it's not accepting that from a standpoint of, I'm going to be a sinner, so I can just do whatever I want. It's accepting that when you fail, you take responsibility, you pick yourself up, you tie your boots tight, you rectify what you've done wrong, and you never repeat it again. And I think that's the separation between good and great leaders. The great leaders are those people who are not afraid to fail, who have a high tolerance for risk, and who take accountability when they make a mistake, and they turn around and make it into lemonade out of lemons.
Right. You talked about that a lot of the good leadership books come from the Reform movement. And I think we because of that, we sometimes separate leadership and shepherding. Are those two things different, or are they synonymous?
They're absolutely synonymous in my book, and in the physical book as well that I wrote. They are absolutely synonymous. The cover of my book is proof of that. I didn't have any creativity in choosing that cover. CPH actually chose it for me, but I couldn't have been happier, because the image on the front of the book is a shepherd carrying his sheep. In fact, the story is the lost sheep. He leaves the 99 to go get the one. And I think ultimately the shepherding aspect of being a pastoral leader is exactly what I said at the beginning. Pastoral leadership is pastoral care. If you are not giving pastoral care, you're not an effective pastoral leader. I don't care how good you preach, teach, and visit. If you are not shepherding the sheep in the totality of the life of the flock, you're not a good leader. And I'm not afraid to say that to people, because I have a lot of guys in the church who are either in my district or I'm friends with, who are great pastors, but they're not great leaders. They're just not great leaders. And they're not great leaders because they don't care about the sheep outside of Sunday. You see, and I think that's the separation. And I think our Missouri Synod theology on the office of the ministry is so rich, so deep. I'm just thankful to Brother Schultz at CPH for giving me the opportunity to do this. I've been asking, this kind of sounds, self-serving, but it's really true. I've been asking for years that either I or somebody else do some leadership books. And if you haven't noticed, there's been a couple that have come out of CPH. Kurt Sensky had the one on better boards. You had the Professor Peters out of St. Louis that wrote one on change leadership in the congregational side. I was a endorser of that book, and then of course mine on pastoral leadership. We got to pick up the pace, because our theology is worthy of competing with the Reform. Because whenever I did my studies, I had to push aside and throw out a lot of the theological principles of the Reformed Church when it came to this, but yet their stuff is great. I mean, because they actually talk about leadership from a perspective of being the leader and not just talking about it, but being the leader. So
I'm actually going to have Kurt on my podcast in the beginning of 2024. So
good, good man.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, good man.
And maybe I'll write a book on org change for him since I'm doing my doctorate on that.
Good. You should. You should.
So I'm curious about this. You know, you have a chapter in your book, and I love this chapter, is leading according to God's plan. As a leader, I think the hardest thing we have to wrestle with is how do we know if we're leading according to God's plan, or do we do the old thing of, I'll start this process and I'll pray and hope that God joins me in the process? So how do you know if you're actually leading according to God's plan, or you're asking God to catch up with you?
Yeah, I think you've really hit it on the head, right? I mean, if I go into a parish as bishop and I'm dealing with conflict, 99.9% of the time, when the pastor is involved in the conflict, it is the pastor going forward with what he thinks and feels, and he's expecting everybody to come along behind him. And when people aren't, they're wrong. I think God's plan is very clear when it comes to shepherding the sheep. You know, being a pastoral leader means that we adhere to the answer Jesus gives about love. And he says very clearly, there is no greater love than this, than to give your life for your friend. And I think translate that into the pastoral leadership office. As far as I'm concerned, if you're not willing to lay down your life for your sheep, why are you in the business of being a shepherd? I mean, it's just that simple. And that means sometimes that you have to put aside your own desires. And this was hard for me early on, Keith. I want to be very clear. I learned through years of failure that I don't always have to get my way in order for what's happening at the ministry to be good, right, and salutary. You know, I have my own personal desire when it comes to worship. I am an old school kind of, I grew up on TLH. You know, it was the style that I was the most comfortable with when I was a young person. It's the style that I'm the most comfortable with as a pastor. However, I can be a pastor in any environment, in any worship environment, in any physical environment, in any state environment, even California, where my daughter-in-law is from. We have 3 circuits in English district out there, and it's a challenge out there because when you get out to the West Coast, you have a cultural issue that's colliding with the church, right? So it's a multiplier, is what I would say. But I think, as far as I'm concerned, God's plan is teaching and equipping your people about 3 things. A, the gospel message of Christ, clearly and first and foremost, and that would include the sacraments in both delivery and teaching. The second thing is understanding that all of God's people are equal and worthy. You know, the biblical understanding of diversity is not societal understanding of diversity. God says, the Bible says, we are all created in God's image. In the image of God, we are created. Therefore, the church must understand that every person of every ethnicity and every creed and color must be dealt with equally in the church. It just so happens the Missouri Synod is predominantly a white church, but that doesn't change what we should be teaching our people in terms of what they should be doing and the church should be doing as an outreach. And then the third thing for me is very, very simple, and that is good stewardship leads to good resources, and the biblical standard of the Matthew parable, to whom much is given, much is expected, and if you can be entrusted with little, God will entrust you with great things. And so those 3 things, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of God's plan, if they're not being taught, lived, and promoted in the church, we as pastoral leaders are failing. And I just have to say this. I know this won't be popular, but I think there's a lot of guys out there that they're not succeeding in their pastoral care because they're leaving out certain elements that God's plan dictates we provide his people. And in today's society, it's more important now than it ever has been in my lifetime to teach the totality of Scripture and not just parts of it. Mm-hmm. Right. That's right. That's right. Yeah, look, I can tell you very honestly, my greatest failure in ministry was a situation that I still believe to this day I would redo the same way, except I would pick up the pace. Because what happened was we had a national daycare come to the church, and they wanted to rent an acre of property to build a daycare facility and build a parking lot, and we would have access to that building on the Sundays for. And what I ended up doing is I ended up saying, well, let's build it as an extension of our current building, and we'll build a whole education wing. You'll get all the classrooms you need. We'll get a new sanctuary. We were growing. We needed this. It was all the right thing. But I tried to make it so perfect that it took a year and a half. And when we went to bid, we were about $300,000 over what our budget was, and we had to scrap the whole thing. Because in my mind, having a new sanctuary was the most important thing, right? And my people followed me. The company followed me. They paid for half the architectural fees. Everybody was following my leadership. But I placed the sanctuary as the priority instead of the revenue we could have gotten for the building if we'd have let them have the property. And we missed out on about $20,000 a year. And I chased a dream. Now, if I could do it all over again today, I would chase the dream again, but I'd do it faster. So I know about construction now way more, that I could get us to the bid process and get to that number that we needed. So yeah, I think sometimes as a pastoral leader, you only learn out of failing. You just only learn when you fail and make mistakes. So right, right. That's right. Well, it's the blowing of the mind you're speaking of, and I've learned the same lesson different way. Is in our mind we've already processed the impossible, right? We've already seen it as the impossible, and now we've convinced ourselves that it's possible. And we're asking people in that kind of a presentation to automatically believe it's possible before they've had a chance to process the impossible. And I think pastors who want to push, drive, they got to let the people catch up. They got to let the people process what you and I already processed 20 minutes before we even said it. That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah, first I want to go back to say something that's very important to this whole discussion about my book, and that is this book is not just for pastors. In fact, I have gotten some of the greatest feedback from lay people who have read it. And I sold out of the book at LWML convention when I was doing my book signing, so it was amazing to me, right? But the most important quality I would say when it comes to pastoral leadership is trust. Your people have to trust you, and once you get the trust of your people, you can lead them to the edge of the bridge. I mean, really. And in some cases, even in my own 20-year history in Pittsburgh at my congregation, I probably could have led them off the bridge, meaning they trusted me that much, right? And if you talk to some of them, they might say he did try to take us off the bridge. You never know. But the point is, I tell all young pastors when we get new guys into the district, I say, look, take the time to earn your people's trust. and you can do pretty much anything you want as a pastor. And when I say anything you want as a pastor, if you want to make a change in the liturgical service, if you want to sing a specific song, I'm still very anal about Advent and Lenten midweeks singing "Abide with Me" as the closing hymn at the night service, right? There's just something magical about that song for me in the darkness of the winter or the spring. I didn't get to do that until after about 4 years, and then I got to make that change. And when people complained about it, I said, "I'm doing the hymn picking. You know, I mean, you want to be the pastor, you can pick the hymns. I'm picking hymns. I want to abide with me, right?" But I was able to get to the point where I could make that kind of comment and I could take that kind of a stand because my people trusted me and they loved me. And when you get to that place as a pastor, ministry is much funner, right? The problem is, and I think you would agree, being in the position you're in the district, we got too many guys who aren't willing to take the time to get the trust necessary to be effective as a pastoral leader. That's the problem. Guys want to go from 0 to 50 overnight. That's right. That's right. That's right. Right. Yeah. No, in fact, I had a conversation this morning with a pastor who's in this boat. I won't go into the circumstances, but I'll say this. He made a decision. He didn't consult the congregation. The congregation is upset because they believed he was doing a power play. So he asked me that question this morning, how can I regain trust with people? And I answer that question the same almost every single time, regardless of the breach of trust. And that is this: be honest, be vulnerable. When you make a mistake, take responsibility in public. I remember an older pastor said to me one time, and it's never going to leave my brain. He said, "Look, if you've made a bad judgment call, if you've made a mistake, if you've given advice that was wrong, stand up in front of your congregation, ask for their forgiveness, acknowledge your mistake." He said, and there's 2 reasons for that. Number 1, they'll see you as an equal, as a vulnerable person who needs forgiveness. And number 2, according to the biblical standard, they can never hold it against you again if you're forgiven. Now you think about that, Keith. It's kind of revolutionary when you think about it, because it's true. Theologically, it's true. If you confess your sin and are forgiven, the Bible says your sins are as far from the east as from the west. And so the theological principle for me is my teaching principle for my guys, i.e., if you've made a mistake, own up to it, because they can no longer hold it against you. And I think in my career, and both as bishop and president and also as parish pastor in Pittsburgh, 2 things that have given me success. Number 1, I'm transparent with my leadership, both at the board of directors now and in the parish. And number 2, I'm honest with them. If I've made a mistake, I come to them and I say, "Look, I told you we should do this. We did it. I was wrong. I miscalculated on this or that. And we should go this way." And I can tell you, my life as a district president has been radically changed from the very beginning of my ministry as district president, because my board quickly trusted me, and that afforded me expanse to do things that I would have had to spend a lot of time gaining their trust. And so some congregations are very trusting and some are very distrusting. And to your question, how do you regain trust? It's always with transparency and honesty at every turn, over everything. As simple as, what do you do during the month? I don't know if you've experienced this, but I'll tell you, one of the things that I've experienced that is horrible are pastors who don't understand the value of giving a detailed report. Like, I used to have a report that had 2 sections, official acts and non-official acts. Bible studies, sermon prep, that was the official stuff. Baptisms, whatnot. The unofficial stuff were meetings, consultations, counseling sessions, and I had like 20 categories, and I would put the number of events and the time it took me. So when I sat down in an elders meeting and they said, "What did you do this month?" And they looked at my report and they go, "Oh my goodness, he had 47 meetings. He had 17 visitations. This guy is overworked." Now, you can play a little bit of a game there and inflate the numbers and try to make yourself look good. But the reason I did it was just to let them know what I was doing. It built trust by the very fact that I was giving it to them, if that makes sense. That's right. That's right. That's right. That's right. That's right. I couldn't agree with you more. You know, I'm excited that I've been doing the job as bishop and president for 8 years now, and I'm sure Steve would say the same thing to you. The first 3 years is kind of like you're overwhelmed because you're just trying to get your feet underneath you. Bylaws, leaders. I mean, it's really the office of bishop and president is really overwhelming until you get your hands around it, and then it becomes enjoyable. At least for me. I don't want to speak for all the guys, but for me, the last 3 or 4 years have been enjoyable. And I'm looking forward to the opportunity of helping our young pastors grow and mature in their leadership and expand the church by taking seriously where we close one congregation, we're going to open another one intentionally. And that's been my most recent couple last 3 years. We've had a couple churches close and give their properties to the district, and we've been intentional with taking those resources and starting new ministries. And I have a high risk tolerance, as we talked about earlier. I'm not afraid to fail. I don't like to fail, and I don't fail often, but I'm not afraid to fail. And so what that means is I take calculated risks. And if they pay off, great. If they don't, fine, but they're calculated. And so we count the cost before we build the building. And we got a great mission plant that we started out in Idaho that's doing phenomenal. Blessed Sacrament Lutheran Ministries. I'm going to be in Arizona in about 3 weeks for a dedication of a new building for Shepherd of the Valley outside of Phoenix. Again, one of these mission plants. And so, in this season of my life, I'm just excited about having the opportunity to use the gifts and talents God has given to me for the sake of the church at the highest levels possible. I mean, and that's my commitment every day when I wake up, is to try to use those gifts as best I can for the sake of the gospel. And, you know me pretty well. I mean, my personality type can be somewhat overwhelming to people, but when you get to know me and you understand that for me, it's about the work of the church, the kingdom. And that's what it's all about. Brotherhood matters. And these things are things I'm hoping to help transfer onto younger pastors so that we can keep that cohesiveness in the church strong. Because if the brotherhood is weak, the church is weak. If the church is weak, the message is weak. And if the message is weak, we're not getting it out. And for me, I want to strengthen the brotherhood. It'll strengthen the message to the world. And that's my daily calling. So I'm excited for that. I mean, I got another 15 or 20 years left in me, full scale, no matter what it is. So I'm going to give it back to the Lord. It's a very simple answer for me. I was asked this recently. I want people to say one thing about Jameson Hardy. He believed what he taught. And that's it. I mean, it sounds simple, might even sound foolish to people, but I want people to be able to say, when Pastor Hardy taught, preached, administered the sacraments, whatever he did, he believed what he taught us. And that's very important to me, because I think we got too many guys that are good orators of the gospel. And sometimes I wonder, do they really believe what they're trying to say? Are they really? Do we smell what they're cooking according to the rock? You know what I mean? And I'm not convinced with some guys that I can smell what they're cooking, because they can say it well, but then how does it translate over into life? And I've always told people, you can pay me no higher compliment than to tell people Hardy believed what he taught. Nah. The only last thing I'd say about the book itself is simply this. I wrote it with the intention of being able to use it in kind of a corporate or personal Bible study way. At the end of every chapter, there are a few questions for reflection. And it's why it's not just for pastors, because a layperson can take the book, they can sit down and read it. And for instance, at the end of that first chapter, one of the questions is in such a fashion, what kind of struggles do you have in your leadership style? And I just told a congregation last night in the meeting, the best churches we have great pastors and great lay leaders. We have some churches with great pastors. We have some churches with great lay leaders, and those churches independently might be good corporately. But the best churches have good pastors and good lay leaders. And so when you put those two together, you got a winning combination. And so that's why I wanted to write this book in a way that it could be used by pastors and lay people. It could be used, in a congregational setting where a pastor can help his people. And I had a woman at LWML ask me about, is this book just for pastors? And I jokingly said to her, no, it's for lay people and learn how to deal with their difficult pastors. She's like, I need to buy a copy of that. And I need to, So. Yeah, I appreciate it. You can go to Amazon for the book. You can go to CPH's website for the book, and I'm on Facebook, and anybody can send me an email at pastorhardy72@yahoo.com. I'll be glad to chat with you. I'll tell you, Keith, the greatest compliment I've been paid about my book came from a Wisconsin Lutheran layperson who sent me an email and said to me that he bought my book, he read it, and he called the seminary president in Thiensville, Wisconsin, and asked him how many seminarians he had so he could buy a book for all the seminarians. This is Wisconsin Synod, my friends. He won't even pray with us, but he wants us to. You want to use my leadership book. So it was the greatest compliment I could have been paid by anybody so far about my book. So. Look at this, see? We're making way in the world today. Thanks, Keith, for having me on. It's been a blessing.